Q de ban nuon lam noi dung video YouTube la, fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Billionaire CEO sneered, Maid's daughter did. He froze in shock. Nu muon chuan gu fap va tu nin han theo fong catch chu de YouTube mai, ko the chin na tan. Fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Billionaire CEO sneered, then the maid's daughter did it, leaving him frozen in shock. Hok ju dung fong catch drama dang thin han. Fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Billionaire CEO sneered, the maid's daughter did it, and he froze in shock. Chu de kat loi toi zak nen la, fix this and I'll give you $100 million. Billionaire CEO sneered, maid's daughter did, he froze in shock. The challenge should have ended as a joke. That was what most people in the research facility believed as they watched the young girl standing beside her mother. Amelia Carter kept her eyes lowered, wishing they could leave before the attention became even more uncomfortable. She had spent years working quietly in the building, cleaning offices long after executives had gone home. Most people barely noticed her. Today was different. Today every eye seemed fixed on her daughter. Sophie Carter stood calmly in front of the machine that had frustrated some of the brightest engineers in the company for nearly 3 days. The room buzzed with whispers. Some employees smiled politely. Others openly smirked. They assumed the same thing. A teenager with no official position could not possibly solve a problem that experts had failed to solve. At the center of the crowd, Harrison Thorne folded his arms. The billionaire chief executive officer had built his reputation on spotting talent and exposing weakness. In his mind, this was simply another lesson. He expected the girl to hesitate, make a few guesses, and then walk away embarrassed. Instead, Sophie stepped closer to the machine and studied it without touching anything. She ignored the crowd completely. Her attention moved from one display panel to another. Numbers flashed across several monitors. Engineers exchanged puzzled looks as she examined data that most visitors would not even understand. 1 minute passed. Then another. The silence grew heavier. Harrison noticed something strange. Sophie was not acting nervous. She was not trying to impress anyone. She looked focused, almost as if she had seen a similar problem before. Finally, she turned toward the lead engineer. "May I ask a question?" she said. The engineer nodded cautiously. "Why did everyone assume the sensor array was failing?" The engineer frowned. "Because the readings became unstable after the update." Sophie tilted her head slightly. "Did the readings become unstable everywhere?" The engineer paused. "No. Only in specific sections." Sophie looked back at the screens. "Then maybe the sensors are not the problem." Several people exchanged glances. Harrison remained expressionless, but he listened more carefully. Sophie pointed toward a series of charts displayed on a monitor. "The pattern repeats every 47 minutes. A hardware failure would not usually follow such a precise cycle." The lead engineer stepped closer. "What are you suggesting?" Sophie answered without hesitation. "I think the system is receiving conflicting instructions from 2 different optimization protocols." The room became noticeably quieter. The engineer's expression changed. He quickly opened additional diagnostic windows. Several minutes passed while he reviewed the information. Then his eyes widened. Another engineer joined him. Then another. Their conversation became increasingly urgent. Harrison slowly uncrossed his arms. The confidence on his face began to soften. Sophie had identified something that nobody else had mentioned during the entire week. Amelia looked from her daughter to the engineers, unsure what was happening. She had always known Sophie was intelligent, but even she seemed surprised by the reaction. One of the senior engineers suddenly turned toward Harrison. "Sir, she may be right." Harrison did not answer immediately. "Verify it," he said. The engineers worked rapidly. Commands appeared across multiple screens. New diagnostic tests were launched. The crowd watched every movement. After nearly 20 minutes, a notification appeared on the central display. The conflicting protocols were isolated. The system immediately stabilized. Error warnings disappeared one after another. A low murmur spread through the room. Several employees stared at the screens in disbelief. The issue that had consumed an entire team for days had been identified in less than half an hour by the daughter of a cleaning employee. Harrison stared at the monitor. Then he looked at Sophie. For the first time since the encounter began, he was not looking at her with amusement. He was looking at her with genuine curiosity. And deep inside, a question he never expected to ask began forming in his mind. Who exactly was this girl? The atmosphere inside the research facility changed completely. Only 30 minutes earlier, Sophie Carter had been viewed as an outsider standing beside her mother, a cleaning employee whom most executives barely acknowledged. Now the same people who had dismissed her were staring at her with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Harrison Thorne remained silent as the engineering team continued reviewing the results. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. The system had not suffered from a hardware failure. The source of the disruption had been a conflict buried deep within two optimization protocols that had been introduced during separate software updates. Somehow, a 17-year-old girl had noticed a pattern that an entire department had overlooked. One of the senior engineers finally stepped away from the control station. "The issue is resolved," he announced. "System stability has returned to normal levels." A wave of relieved conversation spread through the room. Several employees applauded quietly. Others simply looked stunned. Harrison watched Sophie carefully. He had spent decades evaluating people. Experience had taught him that luck existed, but true insight looked different. What he had witnessed did not feel like luck. "How did you see it?" he asked. The room immediately fell silent again. Sophie looked at him calmly. "Because everyone was searching for what was broken," she replied. "I was searching for what had changed." Harrison narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Sophie glanced toward the monitor. "The error pattern was too organized. Random failures create random behavior. This pattern." Repeated almost perfectly. That suggested a process rather than a malfunction. When I saw that, I stopped looking at the hardware and started thinking about competing instructions. Several engineers exchanged impressed looks. Harrison said nothing for a moment. Then he asked another question. "Have you studied engineering?" Amelia shifted nervously. She worried the conversation was moving into dangerous territory. Sophie answered honestly. "No official program." "Then where did you learn this?" Sophie hesitated before speaking. "From public lectures, technical journals, online courses, and research papers." A few employees smiled skeptically. Harrison noticed it immediately. "You doubt her?" he asked one engineer. The man looked uncomfortable. "It is just unusual." Sophie remained composed. "Knowledge is not unusual," she said softly. "Access is." The statement landed with unexpected force. Several people lowered their eyes. Amelia felt her throat tighten. She knew exactly how many nights her daughter had spent reading borrowed materials while other teenagers were sleeping. Harrison looked at Amelia. For the first time, he seemed to truly notice her presence. He noticed the worn uniform, the tired posture, and the quiet dignity she carried despite years of being overlooked. Something about the situation unsettled him. His company invested billions of dollars searching for talent around the world. Yet one of the most remarkable minds he had encountered recently had been standing inside his own building the entire time. "How old are you?" he asked. 17. Another murmur moved through the crowd. Harrison turned toward the lead engineer. If she had applied for an internship, would she have been selected? The engineer hesitated. His silence provided the answer. Sophie lacked the credentials, recommendations, and connections that normally open doors. Harrison understood that reality better than anyone. For years he had defended the system because he believed it rewarded excellence. Standing here now, he was no longer completely certain. Before he could say anything else, another engineer approached carrying a tablet. "Sir, there is something else." Harrison accepted it. The screen displayed an internal report generated after the system recovered. His expression slowly changed as he read. The optimization conflict Sophie identified had been creating hidden inefficiencies for nearly 6 months. The financial impact was enormous. Correcting the issue would save the company tens of millions of dollars annually. The room grew quiet again. Harrison looked up from the tablet and stared directly at Sophie. The challenge he had made earlier suddenly felt far less amusing than it had before. And for the first time that day, he began wondering whether his careless promise might carry consequences far beyond what anyone in the room had imagined. Harrison Thorne remained motionless for several seconds after reading the report. Around him, conversations gradually faded as employees noticed the change in his expression. The numbers displayed on the tablet were impossible to ignore. The conflict Sophie Carter had identified was not merely causing technical disruptions. It had been quietly reducing efficiency throughout several divisions of the company. The projected savings from correcting the issue were staggering. Harrison lowered the tablet and looked directly at Sophie. For the first time that day, nobody in the room saw amusement in his eyes. They saw calculation. They saw respect. And perhaps something even rarer: uncertainty. Harrison had built an empire by trusting his judgment. He had evaluated thousands of candidates over the years. Prestigious universities competed to place graduates inside his organization. Entire recruitment teams existed for the sole purpose of identifying exceptional talent. Yet a 17-year-old girl with no official credentials had just exposed a problem that his experts had missed. The realization was uncomfortable. "How long did it take you to recognize the pattern?" he asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "About 10 minutes. A few engineers exchanged looks of disbelief. Harrison noticed. "And if nobody had interrupted you?" Sophie answered honestly. "Maybe another 10 minutes to confirm it." The room fell silent again. One senior manager quietly shook his head. Another stared at the floor. The implications were becoming impossible to avoid. Harrison walked slowly toward the central display screen. "Show me the historical logs," he instructed. The engineering team immediately complied. Years of operational data appeared across multiple monitors. Harrison reviewed them carefully. Then he turned back towards Sophie. "Would you be willing to look at something else?" Amelia immediately became nervous. "Sir, we should probably leave. My shift is almost over." Harrison glanced at her. His voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Carter, I would appreciate a few more minutes." The respectful tone surprised everyone, including Amelia herself. Harrison rarely adjusted his manner for anyone. Sophie stepped forward. "What would you like me to examine?" Harrison pointed toward another dataset. "This division has experienced declining performance for almost a year. Multiple consultants have reviewed it. Nobody agrees on the cause." Several executives looked uneasy. This issue had become a frequent source of frustration within the company. Sophie studied the information without speaking. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The crowd watched with growing anticipation. Finally, Sophie pointed toward a section of the data. "Everyone keeps analyzing departments separately." Harrison folded his arms. "Go on. The problem is not inside the departments. The problem is communication between them." Several managers frowned. Sophie continued. "Each team is optimizing for its own targets. Those targets compete with each other. The system rewards local success even when it creates global inefficiency." One executive immediately objected. "That is an oversimplification." Sophie remained calm. "Then compare resource allocation against project completion rates over the last 11 months. The executive opened his mouth to respond but stopped. Engineers quickly pulled up the requested comparison. As new charts appeared, expressions around the room changed dramatically. Sophie's observation matched the data almost perfectly. Harrison stared at the screens. Then he looked at the executives standing nearby. Nobody spoke. Nobody challenged the conclusion. For years, leadership meetings had focused on individual departments. Entire strategies had been built around assumptions that suddenly looked incomplete. Harrison felt a strange sensation. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was the realization that someone had entered the room without status, without authority, and without fear of being wrong. That freedom allowed her to see what others overlooked. Amelia watched her daughter with growing disbelief. This was no longer a lucky observation. This was a pattern. Harrison slowly approached Sophie. "Tell me something," he said. "If you had access to every division in this company, what would you do first?" Sophie answered immediately. "Listen." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Just listen?" Sophie nodded. "Most organizations have intelligent people. The problem is that they stop hearing each other." The answer struck the room with surprising force. Harrison said nothing for several seconds. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. Across the facility, employees sensed that something important had just shifted. What began as a public challenge was turning into something nobody had expected. And Harrison was beginning to understand that the most valuable discovery of the day was not hidden inside a machine. It was standing directly in front of him. The room remained unusually quiet after Sophie's answer. Even the executives who normally dominated every discussion seemed content to listen. Harrison Thorne glanced around the facility and noticed something he had not seen in years. People were paying attention not because of his position, but because of someone else's ideas. The realization was both humbling and fascinating. He turned toward the senior leadership team. "How many consultants have reviewed these operational problems during the past year?" One executive cleared his throat. 7 firms, sir." Harrison nodded slowly. "And how much have we spent?" Another executive answered reluctantly. "Approximately $12 million. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Harrison looked back at Sophie. "And you identified the core issue in less than 15 minutes. Sophie did not smile. "I identified what might be the issue. Data should always be verified." The response immediately earned respect from several engineers. She was not claiming certainty. She was following the same discipline that serious researchers valued. Harrison noticed that too. The confidence he saw in her was not arrogance. It came from curiosity and careful thinking. One of the vice presidents stepped forward. "Sir, perhaps we should schedule a formal review before drawing conclusions." Sophie nodded. "I agree." The executive appeared surprised. He had expected resistance. Instead, Sophie continued. "A good idea survives testing. A bad idea should fail testing." Harrison laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from him that day. "You are making it difficult for people to disagree with you." Sophie shrugged. "That is not my goal. Understanding the problem is." Amelia watched the exchange with growing disbelief. For years she had cleaned conference rooms where important decisions were made. She had listened to fragments of conversations while emptying trash bins and organizing workspaces after meetings ended. Never once had she imagined her daughter would stand in the center of such a discussion. Harrison suddenly turned toward Amelia. "How long have you worked here?" Amelia looked startled. "Almost 11 years." Harrison frowned slightly. 11 years. He repeated the number as though hearing it for the first time. "And nobody ever mentioned your daughter?" Amelia shook her head. "There was never a reason to." Harrison looked around the room. The answer bothered him more than he expected. His company prided itself on identifying opportunity. Yet somehow an extraordinary young mind had remained invisible despite spending years only a few floors away from some of the world's most accomplished professionals. A notification appeared on one of the large displays. The engineering team had completed additional verification tests. The lead engineer approached carrying updated results. "The savings estimate has increased," he said carefully. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Increased?" "Yes, sir. The original projection only considered direct operational improvements. The broader impact across multiple divisions is significantly larger." Harrison reviewed the numbers. This time he did not hide his reaction. Several executives saw his eyes widen. The financial benefit was no longer measured in tens of millions. It was approaching a level that would affect future earnings reports. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Harrison lowered the tablet and looked directly at Sophie. He remembered every word of the challenge he had made earlier. At the time, it had been delivered with confidence and a touch of mockery. He never believed anyone would actually succeed. Now the memory felt increasingly uncomfortable. Sophie noticed his expression but said nothing. She seemed completely uninterested in the attention surrounding her. Instead, she continued examining charts displayed on a nearby screen. Harrison found that remarkable. Most people would already be imagining rewards, recognition, or opportunities. Sophie appeared focused only on solving problems. Finally, Harrison took a slow breath. "Miss Carter," he said. Every conversation in the facility stopped instantly. "I believe we need to continue this discussion somewhere more private." Several executives exchanged curious looks. Amelia became nervous again. Sophie simply nodded. Harrison glanced toward the leadership conference room overlooking the research floor. Then he looked back at the young woman who had changed the entire mood of the building in a single afternoon. For the first time in many years, the billionaire felt something he rarely experienced. He was eager to learn what someone else might teach him. The walk to the conference room felt strangely quiet. Executives, engineers, and managers stepped aside as Harrison Thorne, Amelia Carter, and Sophie Carter moved across the research floor. Through the glass walls, employees watched with curiosity. News traveled quickly inside the company, and everyone understood that something extraordinary had happened. Once inside the conference room, Harrison closed the door and motioned for them to sit. The room overlooked the entire facility. For years, major decisions affecting thousands of employees had been made at this table. Amelia sat carefully near the edge of her chair. Sophie appeared calm as always. Harrison remained standing for a moment, looking out across the building he had spent decades creating. Finally, he turned around. "I want to understand something," he said. "Not the technical problem. Not the operational problem. I want to understand you." Sophie met his gaze. "What would you like to know?" Harrison sat down. "How does someone your age acquire this level of knowledge without formal access to the resources that usually produce it?" Sophie considered the question. "The same way most people learn anything. One page at a time." Harrison smiled faintly. "That answer sounds simple." "Most important things are simple," Sophie replied. "Not easy. Just simple." Harrison leaned back. "Tell me about your education." Sophie explained how she had spent years studying public research papers, university lectures, open educational materials, and technical publications. She described waking early before school, studying late at night, and taking detailed notes from sources available to anyone willing to invest the time. Amelia listened quietly. Much of what her daughter described was familiar. She remembered evenings when Sophie sat at a small kitchen table surrounded by notebooks while other teenagers spent hours on entertainment. Harrison listened without interruption. The more he heard, the more uncomfortable he became. His company spent enormous amounts of money searching for exceptional talent. Yet this young woman had developed remarkable analytical skills using resources that cost almost nothing. "Why did you never apply here?" he finally asked. Sophie gave a small smile. "Apply for what?" Harrison blinked. "Internships. Programs. Research opportunities." Sophie answered honestly. "Most required credentials I did not have. Others required recommendations from people I had never met." Harrison looked down at the table. Nobody needed to explain what she meant. The system was designed to identify excellence, but often it only recognized excellence when it arrived through familiar channels. A brief silence followed. Then Harrison asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind all afternoon. "Did you know who I was before today?" Sophie nodded. "Of course. And what did you think?" Sophie hesitated. Amelia looked nervous. Harrison noticed and shook his head. "Answer honestly." Sophie folded her hands. "I thought you were brilliant." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That sounds positive." "It was," Sophie said. But I also thought you were probably surrounded by people who rarely disagreed with you. The room became quiet again. Harrison stared at her for several seconds before laughing softly. Not because the statement was amusing, but because it was accurate. Over time, success had created an environment where too many people preferred agreement over truth. You might be right, he admitted. Sophie nodded. That happens to many successful people. Harrison looked toward the research floor below. For years he had believed his greatest asset was intelligence. Today he was beginning to wonder whether curiosity mattered even more. The difference between them was not knowledge. It was perspective. Sophie approached every problem with the assumption that she might learn something new. Harrison realized he had gradually stopped doing that. A knock interrupted the conversation. The lead engineer entered carrying another report. Sir, he said carefully, the board has already been informed about what happened today. Harrison accepted the document. Several directors had sent messages asking for details. Some were requesting immediate meetings. Others wanted a complete review of the findings. Harrison looked at the report, then at Sophie. For the second time that afternoon, he felt the weight of a promise he had never expected to matter. And as the significance of the day's events continued growing, he understood that the next decision he made could change far more than a single company. The lead engineer left the conference room, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Harrison Thorne remained seated with the report in his hands while messages continued arriving from board members, division leaders, and investors. News of the afternoon's events was spreading far beyond the research floor. Yet despite the growing attention, his focus remained fixed on the young woman sitting across from him. Sophie Carter showed no sign of excitement. She was not checking the reactions of executives. She was not asking about opportunities. She was not even curious about the discussions taking place among senior leadership. Instead, she seemed interested only in understanding problems and finding solutions. Harrison found that increasingly rare. Most people would be celebrating right now, he said. Sophie looked up. Why? Harrison almost laughed. Because you just solved a problem that affected one of the largest technology companies in the country. Sophie considered the statement. The problem existed whether I solved it or not. Being excited does not change the outcome. Harrison shook his head. You see the world differently. Everyone sees the world differently, Sophie replied. The challenge is understanding viewpoints other than your own. Amelia listened quietly. Throughout the conversation she noticed something remarkable. Harrison was no longer questioning Sophie. He was learning from her. The balance in the room had shifted. For years executives had entered this conference room hoping to impress the billionaire founder. Today the billionaire founder seemed more interested in listening than speaking. Another notification appeared on Harrison's tablet. He opened it and reviewed the latest update from the finance department. The revised projections confirmed the earlier estimates. The operational improvements identified by Sophie would generate extraordinary value over the coming years. Harrison placed the tablet on the table and exhaled slowly. Do you remember exactly what I said downstairs? He asked. Sophie nodded. Yes. Amelia looked confused. Harrison smiled faintly. I was hoping you might not. Sophie remained calm. You challenged me to fix the problem. Harrison nodded. And I made a promise. The room grew quiet. Amelia suddenly understood where the conversation was heading. Her eyes widened. Harrison looked toward the massive windows overlooking the facility. At the time, I believed there was no chance anyone would succeed. Sophie did not respond. I was not serious. Harrison continued. At least I did not think I was. Sophie studied him carefully. But now? Harrison looked back at her. Now I am dealing with facts instead of assumptions. Before anyone could continue, another knock came at the door. This time 3 senior board members entered through a secure video conference connection displayed on the wall screen. Their expressions revealed a mixture of curiosity and urgency. One director spoke first. Harrison, we have reviewed the preliminary reports. Are they accurate? Harrison nodded. They are. Another director leaned forward. And the individual responsible for the discovery? Harrison glanced towards Sophie. She is sitting across from me. The directors looked surprised. They had expected an experienced consultant or a veteran engineer. Instead, they saw a teenager beside her mother. Questions immediately followed. How had she identified the issue? What was her background? What were her qualifications? Sophie answered respectfully but honestly. By the end of the discussion, the director seemed as impressed as everyone else. When the meeting finally ended, Harrison remained thoughtful. He stood and walked toward the window once more. Far below, employees continued moving across the research floor, unaware that a conversation taking place above them might soon reshape the future of the company. Harrison turned around. His expression was completely different from the one he wore at the beginning of the day. The confidence remained, but the arrogance had disappeared. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I have spent most of my life believing that talent eventually finds its way to the top." He paused. "Today I realized something important. Sometimes talent is already standing in the room. Everyone else simply fails to notice it." Sophie's expression softened slightly. For the first time, Harrison saw a hint of emotion behind her calm demeanor. And as the afternoon moved toward evening, he knew the next words he spoke would become one of the most important decisions of his career. For several seconds nobody spoke. The conference room remained completely still as Harrison Thorne looked at Sophie Carter and considered everything that had happened since the afternoon began. He had entered the research facility expecting to demonstrate authority. Instead, he had been forced to confront assumptions he did not even realize he carried. The silence finally ended when Harrison returned to his seat. "There is something I need to address," he said. Amelia immediately sensed the seriousness in his voice. Sophie remained attentive. Harrison folded his hands on the table. "Throughout my career, I have always believed that results matter more than appearances. Today I learned that believing something and practicing it are not always the same thing." Amelia looked down. She knew exactly what he meant. For years she had walked through the company unnoticed. Nobody had treated her badly, but very few people had truly seen her either. Harrison continued. "When I first saw you downstairs, I made assumptions. I saw a cleaning employee and her daughter. I assumed I understood the entire story before either of you spoke a single word." The admission surprised even Harrison himself. He was not known for public self-reflection. Sophie listened quietly. "Most people do that," she said. "It is easier than asking questions." Harrison nodded slowly. "And sometimes very expensive." A faint smile appeared on several faces around the room. The tension eased slightly. Harrison reached for the tablet containing the latest financial projections. He turned the screen towards Sophie and Amelia. "These numbers are still preliminary, but they are already significant." Amelia glanced at the figures and immediately looked away. The values were so large they barely felt real. Sophie examined them carefully. "The estimates will probably change after additional analysis," she said. Harrison laughed softly. "You continue to be the most cautious person in the room. Evidence should come before conclusions," Sophie replied. Harrison nodded. "Another lesson worth remembering." As the conversation continued, the sun slowly lowered outside the glass walls of the building. The golden evening light stretched across the research floor below. Employees were beginning to leave for the day, yet many continued glancing toward the conference room. Rumors had already spread throughout the company. Some people believed a major discovery had occurred. Others believed a new consultant was being hired. Almost nobody knew the full story. Harrison looked toward Amelia. "Mrs. Carter, may I ask you something?" She seemed surprised. "Of course. Did you know your daughter was capable of this?" Amelia smiled gently. "I knew she was special. I did not know the world would notice." The answer stayed with Harrison. He thought about the thousands of talented people whose abilities remained unseen because nobody took the time to look beyond titles, backgrounds, or expectations. He had spent years searching globally for innovation, while overlooking potential that existed much closer to home. Finally, he opened a folder that had been placed on the table earlier. Inside were several documents prepared by senior leadership after receiving the board's emergency messages. Harrison reviewed them briefly before sliding them aside. "The board wants recommendations," he said. "The executives want action plans. Investors want explanations." He paused and looked directly at Sophie. "I want something else." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" Harrison answered without hesitation. "I want to know what you would build if nobody told you what was possible and what was impossible." For the first time all day, Sophie did not answer immediately. She looked out across the research facility below. Hundreds of intelligent people worked there. Millions of dollars in technology surrounded them. Yet the question seemed larger than any machine or project. After a long moment, she finally spoke. "I would build a place where talent is discovered before it is judged." The words settled over the room like a quiet wave. Harrison felt an unexpected chill. Not because the idea was complicated, but because it was simple. And because deep down he knew how many lives could change if someone actually did it. As evening shadows filled the building, Harrison realized that the most important opportunity created that day was not financial, technological, or strategic. It was the chance to correct a mistake that countless organizations repeated every day. And for the first time since meeting Sophie Carter, he began thinking not about what she had already accomplished, but about what she might accomplish next. The conference room remained quiet after Sophie's answer. Harrison Thorne slowly leaned back in his chair and looked out over the facility that had defined most of his adult life. Thousands of employees, hundreds of projects, billions of dollars in investments, and yet one of the most valuable lessons he had learned had arrived from a 17-year-old girl whose mother cleaned the building after business hours. The realization stayed with him. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Harrison reached into a folder resting beside him and removed a single sheet of paper. Amelia watched nervously. Sophie remained calm. Harrison placed the document on the table. "Earlier today I made a promise," he said. "At the time I assumed it was impossible that anyone would earn it." Amelia immediately knew what he meant. Sophie remembered as well. Harrison looked directly at her. "I have built my reputation on honoring commitments. If my word means something when circumstances are easy, it must mean something when circumstances become difficult." Amelia felt her heart begin to race. Harrison continued. "The board has already reviewed the financial impact of what happened today. The value created by identifying those hidden inefficiencies will likely exceed the original estimates." He paused before adding, "by a significant margin." Sophie glanced at the document but did not reach for it. "Why are you telling me this?" Harrison smiled faintly. "Because you seem to be the only person in the building who is not thinking about money." A brief silence followed. Then Sophie answered honestly. "Money solves some problems. It does not solve all of them." Harrison nodded. "Another reason this conversation matters." He pushed the paper slightly closer. "The promise remains real. However, before discussing numbers, I need to understand something. If you suddenly had access to extraordinary resources, what would you do with them?" Many people would have answered immediately. Sophie did not. She considered the question carefully. Finally, she said, "I would create opportunities for people who are overlooked." Harrison listened. "How?" "Scholarships. Research access. Mentorship programs. Places where potential matters more than background." Amelia looked at her daughter with pride. Harrison remained silent for several seconds. Then he laughed softly. "You are aware that most people your age would have started with luxury cars and private islands." Sophie shrugged. "Those things are easy to buy. Opportunity is harder." Harrison looked down at the document, and then back at Sophie. The answer seemed to confirm everything he had learned about her throughout the day. Intelligence alone had impressed him. Character impressed him even more. Another message arrived from the board. Harrison reviewed it quickly before placing the tablet aside. "The directors want to meet you," he said. Sophie looked surprised. Why? Because they think they are looking at the future. Sophie shook her head. The future is a lot bigger than one person. Harrison smiled again. You make it very difficult for anyone to put you on a pedestal. Good, Sophie replied. People learn less when they spend all their time admiring someone. The evening light continued fading beyond the glass walls. Employees were leaving the building now. Yet many still glanced upward toward the conference room, wondering what was happening behind those doors. None of them could hear the conversation. None of them knew that one ordinary afternoon had transformed into a moment that would be remembered for years. Harrison finally stood and walked toward the window. He looked down at the research floor where everything had started. Then he turned back toward Amelia and Sophie. This morning I thought I was testing someone else, he said quietly. Now I realize I was the one being tested. Amelia felt tears forming in her eyes. Not because of wealth or recognition, but because someone powerful had finally acknowledged what she had always known. Sophie possessed extraordinary gifts. Harrison met Sophie's gaze one final time. Tomorrow will bring contracts, meetings, headlines, and endless discussions. But before any of that happens, there is something I want you to understand. Sophie waited. Harrison's expression softened. The greatest value you created today was not measured in dollars. You reminded an entire company that talent can come from anywhere. And that lesson may end up being worth more than anything written on that piece of paper.